My name is Frank Dimmock, and you'll see from the slide the topic of our presentation. I'm the one that's listed on the program, and it had started that way, but I realized I was double booked. And speaking at a luncheon at a church that I thought was in a suburb of Minneapolis, but it's in Rochester, Minnesota, which is a 2-hour drive away. So I'm going to have to leave this in the hands of two very capable presenters when I leave shortly. But I'm with the Presbyterian Church USA as a poverty alleviation person, but just back from 3 decades in Africa, serving in a number of countries and working in the area of health and mostly with children. So I have been very interested in this topic for a number of years, both personally and professionally, and have worked with many orphan children who are orphaned by HIV and AIDS because of the death of their parents and are extremely vulnerable to such accusations of witchcraft. So I realized early on that the United Nations departments, many governments were responding to some of the human rights issues of abuse of children through the Convention of the Rights of the Child and child protection strategies. And I wondered where the church was in this. How is the church acting or responding, advocating to the issue of children who've been accused of witchcraft and are doubly traumatized not only by the death of their parents, but also by the accusations of witchcraft. So I realized that fear and envy and gossip was fueling this problem within community, and many of these children ended up on the streets. And it was really within that perspective in the city of Kinshasa, that's now about 10.5 million people, that I realized that so many street children were there as a result of this witchcraft accusations. Just briefly, a personal story before I introduce our two speakers. Back about 10 years ago, my wife and I were in Malawi, living in Lilongwe, and there was a child who had been orphaned at 10 months of age. His father was unknown, and mother was known to be a witch. So this child was left behind. The mother was buried out in a field far from the village at a depth of 10 feet, and no one would take this child into their home because of fear that the child would be carrying on, I guess genetically, some kind of evil spirit. This is the Chewa people in central Malawi. Well, after about 3 months of living outside, this 10-month-old was being cared for, was being fed by people in the village, but stayed outside the whole time, was never brought into anyone's home because of that fear and suspicion. Social welfare learned of this child and took him to what we call a crisis nursery in Lilongwe, which was a nursery for abandoned babies, infant orphans. And my wife was very instrumental in starting that program, and the feeling was, well, this child will be cared for and brought back to health and then put up for adoption or foster care locally, hopefully. Well, the staff of the nursery would not deal with this child either, because they were also afraid that by bringing this child into the nursery, it would be affecting not only the staff but the other children in the nursery. This child was a child of a witch. So we prayed over the child. We brought in a local pastor who performed an exorcism, even though it didn't seem that the child was showing, as an infant, was showing any symptoms of being affected by the witchcraft. But the child could not stay in the nursery. It was pretty clear that the fear and suspicion of this child was too strong, and the child ended up as our 8th child adopted by my wife and I. Well, he's grown to be a very healthy, smart kid, and we're pleased that he's part of our family, and we've been blessed by him. But he did, of course, exhibit some early signs of the trauma that he had experienced, even as an infant, screaming at night and wetting the bed and doing all kinds of things like that. But over time, he has recovered. But through this personal experience and my professional visits to Kinshasa and to Nairobi and to many other places, I realize it's a phenomenon that's on the increase, and children as well as adults are being traumatized. Children are the most vulnerable. They really have no voice, and so I really was searching for what the church could do to prevent this and respond to this. Fortunately, the church in Congo has implemented some things that you'll hear about. I've been collecting books, reading on the topic, and there are a number of books that I have. This one on Kinshasa was written about the street children and the witch children in Kinshasa who live in the cemetery there in Kinshasa. But I'd like to take a moment to introduce two very special people who will be presenting on this topic. First, the Reverend Debbie Brexma is the Africa Area Coordinator for the Presbyterian Church USA, based in Louisville, as I am. She served previously for 16 years as a missionary in Kenya and in South Sudan, and she worked as well as a child protection social worker, training in social work, as well as being an ordained minister, and has co-authored a book titled Bringing Healing to Traumatized Children. And together with Dr. Harriet Hill, our second presenter, who is a specialist really in trauma healing and has worked with the American Bible Society all over the world, but has focused especially in Africa on children and adults who have been traumatized. They will present this paper, and I'm sorry that I have to abandon you and go to this other function, but I know you're in good hands. And I do want to thank all of you for your presentations the last 2 days. I think it's been very enlightening. I leave with more questions than answers. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I look forward to participating in that. Thank you, Debbie.
Good morning. I'm going to be taking a little different view. Many of you have gotten deep into working in a particular context in which it's been delightful to hear what's happening in Togo and Nigeria and Ghana and Tanzania. My perch is from the bird's eye. So I'm in a place where I haven't gotten deep into any of these issues, but I do have the privilege of traveling. We have partnerships in 19 countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and it's been exciting to see what some of our partner churches are doing. So it's going to be an overview of that, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of three different interventions, upstream interventions. What can we do to prevent kids from being victims of abuse and neglect and traumatization because of being accused of being a witch? How can we catch this before they hit the waterfall? So we're trying to what are some of those things? Then we're looking at downstream interventions. What are churches doing in Africa to pick up the pieces of these broken lives? And then for lack of a better word, I've said midstream, and I don't know if that's before or after the waterfall, but there's some things that are done simultaneously, working on prevention as well as working with the children that have been abused and traumatized because of this. So starting out, I'm starting in a spot that maybe some mission organizations don't so much, but I'm coming from a reform perspective and advocacy for strong public policy to address child witchcraft phenomenon. Often that has been left to the NGOs, to the big government organizations, but I think there is a very strong biblical basis and theological basis for that. We read in Amos 5:15, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. In Reformed theology, every part of culture must be under the lordship of Christ. The church is called to be a prophetic voice to the government. John Calvin's call for reformation reached into foreign affairs, law, economics, and public health. Most namely, one of his emphases was improving the sewage system in Geneva. The church needs to be involved in advocating for public policy to protect children from abusive practices at both the local and national level. If good legislation is in place, Christians need to be pushed for it to be enforced. Peace USA, my denomination, has an office in the UN and another one in Washington, D.C. to advocate for good policy and defend human rights according to guidance received from our church partners. One example, strong opposition was raised to the case of Miriam Yahya Ibrahim, a Christian Sudanese woman charged with apostasy from Islam and adultery and sentenced to death. Secondly, church policy on children's rights. Establishing child protection policies can prevent abuse against children and should include forbidding physical and emotional abuse of all children, including those accused of witchcraft. Thirdly, another upstream preventative strategy, research on children accused of witchcraft. Interdisciplinary research on the subject of child witchcraft is sorely lacking. In all my research, that came up strongly that we have not done good work on this as the Christian church. And it's greatly needed to inform an effective response. Secondly, research and documentation on best practices for sensitizing communities to the topic of abuse of children accused of witchcraft and creation of educational resources based upon the research. In my perch, again, in which we work with partner churches in 19 countries, and we're often asked to fund and support and come alongside with mission co-workers to address this concern. And when we're looking for best practices and encouragement of some tools, they're sorely lacking. Number 4, in terms of an upstream intervention, is education and sensitization of congregations and communities. And I'm bringing in examples from the partner churches that I've seen doing some good work. Family life education is so important in creating biblically based courses teaching parenting and relational skills to strengthen families. The Presbyterian Church of East Africa, Makani Jesus in Ethiopia are doing that. And I see this as a preventative strategy, helping strengthen families so that you aren't in the spot that children are being accused of these things. Reconcile in South Sudan, who I served with, leads seminars on preventing and responding to violence against children. Trainers review what does the Bible, as well as the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, say about violence against children, and then compare it with their own cultural practices. We used an exercise in which they looked at some of these cultural practices addressing children who were born out of wedlock, girls who have been raped, women who've been abused. And then we've put it on the table and we've said, let's look at that. Is that something that we need to hold on to and maybe revive, something we lost in the war? Is this just good and we need to hold strongly? Is it something that we need to re-image a bit? Are there parts about it that agree with the Bible, but other parts that don't, and we need to reform it? Or are there some practices that we just need to throw away? Just like in American culture, there's practices we need to throw away. Support of families in crisis. The Church of Central Africa, Presbyterian, provides community-based orphan care, helping provide supportive services to families taking in orphans. Their Strengthening Children program helps to build the resilience and self-esteem of vulnerable children. Also, income generating for families in financial crisis, carried out in Rwanda. And ministry to street families in Madagascar. I've seen wonderful work being done. I was there last month in counseling, worship opportunities, and a program to get families who are on the street an option to get off with Christian support. Some midstream interventions, ones that address both the prevention of children being targeted in this way and the care of children accused of witchcraft. There needs to be specific education and training on the topic of child witchcraft. Education of church leaders with an emphasis on biblical teaching addressing human rights. In the Presbyterian Church of Rwanda did a very interesting workshop recently. They trained all of their pastors on how to respond to demon possession. They looked at mental health, epilepsy, and spiritual causes of people being accused of being possessed. They said that their reformed understanding of deliverance did make a difference in how they did this. They said it's not about the preacher's power, it's about God's power. The pastor does not personally order the spirits to come out, but prays for God to do. And they said, we quietly ask God to deliver the person. We don't need to scream and shout. The Presbyterian Church of Congo provided a seminar for pastors in order to raise awareness of children accused of sorcery and presented a Christian response to the phenomenon. So we're hoping that sermons and Bible studies will start to be addressing this topic. I attended a funeral in South Sudan of a Christian leader who had been well educated on this topic. And at his funeral, the pastor said, remember, Christopher would not want you to meet tomorrow, which was the traditional practice, to decide who caused his death. Please do not do that. That is not what Christopher would want. Thirdly, NetAct and Acrophie Kristaller are institutions that focus on contextual theology and the dialogue between African religion and Christianity and provide strong sources. Conferences, seminars, and focus groups to discuss child witchcraft at the congregational and community level. There was an amazing focus groups held on child witch accusations in Congo, bringing together 36 participants to think about the roots of child witchcraft and the church's response. Community health evangelism might not be thought of as an approach to witchcraft, but you know, community health evangelism focuses on what evangelism and what it takes for a community to be healthy. So the community identifies their own concerns. And I've been in a Presbyterian church in Zambia who identified sexual abuse against young girls as what they wanted to address. So this methodology could be used for witchcraft. Downstream interventions, care for the children accused of witchcraft, foster care. Presbyterian Church of Congo, members in Congo take in children accused of witchcraft and provide a loving home. The foyer is one of their institutions that is a transitional home for children brought off the street, given temporary place to live while they look at work finding permanent homes for these children. Pastoral care, spiritual, physical, emotional care of children accused of witchcraft and inviting them to follow the Good Shepherd. And now I'm turning over to my colleague, Harriet, to talk about another intervention on trauma healing.
Good morning. I guess my claim to have the reason I am interested in witchcraft is I lived in Ivory Coast in different villages. The first village where we lived was very openly pagan. The Christians were like 5% of the population. So we saw a lot of both, calling on the various spirits to solve problems, as well as a lot of talk about witchcraft. And then in the second people group we lived with, they were 100% Christian. And you didn't see much, but a lot was still there in the mind directing explanations for life. So that's where I began to try to understand it, and I agree it's a very big difference. It's a topic that's hard for us to get our heads around as Westerners, but I know it's huge. And so one of the things I just, in the few minutes that remain, is to talk about, and I'll have to do this. Here we are, is to talk about how to help children who have been accused of witchcraft. It's really interesting that many of the symptoms of witchcraft are, how would you know a kid is a witch? Well, there's symptoms that are very parallel to symptoms of a child who's been traumatized. And when we're working with children who have been traumatized, these are some of the symptoms. And so how would you know if this child that you are accusing of being a witch is a child that has experienced trauma and is acting differently because of that? So the trauma can be on the front end of a witchcraft accusation, but also the whole process of being put out, of being tortured, of being exorcised can induce a lot of trauma in a child and reinforce these behaviors. Trauma is being overwhelmed. We're traumatized. It's an event where we're overwhelmed with helplessness, horror, or fear. We have no way out. We have no way to cope. And so it can have actual physical effects on our brain, on our emotions, on our spirits. And so this is just what happens. Not everyone responds in the same way, but very often when people are overwhelmed, and it can be one event, it can be a lifetime of events, but they can have symptoms of re-experiencing the event like they're living it all over again, either during the daytime or at night in nightmares. They can avoid things that are associated with the event, so they don't want to go there anymore. They can't think about that. They can't smell this. They can't eat that food. they panic when they hear a certain sound. Another one is being very detached, emotionally numb, or hyperarousal, they say in the literature, but being on alert all the time. The bad thing might happen again. I have to be very careful. So very panicky. And so children can have these symptoms as well as adults. How do I get this to move? Oh, here we are. Yeah. Here we are. Okay, yeah. So basically, kids need to know they are special. They need safety. They need an ordered universe. They need something that is predictable. They need some control of their life. But in situations of trauma, they get everything on the other column. And this is not a good environment for a child to thrive. Children as well have special challenges when they experience trauma that are different than, it's like their identity is being formed. So this isn't something like I'm a stable adult and then I was raped. This is, I am a child, my personality, my inner being is being formed, and now I'm having this incredible trauma coming through it. So they can lack vocabulary to express their pain. They can, they have no voice. I think that's come up quite a bit. What is the voice? They have no voice. They don't have any say in how their life is going. Many of these children, as we've said, end up on the streets. I think in one study I read, I have some papers that I brought copies of, but like 70% of the children on the street have been accused of witchcraft. And so they are often put out and terrorized. So in the minute that I no longer have, I'll just briefly say the intervention. We have, children can be traumatized by witchcraft, but also life doesn't come in silos like that. You might have witchcraft, you might have abuse of other varieties, domestic abuse, war. So this is some material that has come from Africa and has been helpful in different places. And the goal is to help church people and ordinary people be able to help children heal from their trauma. This is not to train counselors or psychologists or psychiatrists, but where there is trauma, it's often very widespread, and the church is doing an incredible job in helping people heal from trauma, both adults and children, with a bit of care. So we work with Bible stories, especially looking at the story of Joseph, looking at that. We work with memory verses, crafts, songs, games, activities, fun. To hear a kid quote Hebrews 13:5b, the Lord has promised he will never leave us or desert us. It's out of their mouths, out of the situations they come from. These verses take on such power. But helping them also figure out what emotions are, how to put them into words so that they can express their feelings. Here's some of the topics that we cover through stories, through crafts, through exercises that help the kids recover. And then, so one of the ways of dealing with trauma is to create a safe space where people can express their pain and get it out, because as long as it stays in, it blocks them from other stuff, from connecting with God, from doing their schoolwork, from interacting normally and growing normally. But then once you get your pain out, we also bring that pain to Christ, because Christ died for sin and everything sin entails, the death, the tears, the sickness, the abuse. And so we have the children bring their pain to Christ, and it can be a very meaningful time for them to do this, and then talking about forgiveness and reconciliation. So we're doing this in different ways according to the community. There's a lot of space for contextualizing it. It's highly encouraged. But we do it in camps. And we did a camp in Uganda, and I went back about 6 months later and talked with the caregivers, and they were funny. They were saying, did you have a special prayer? We want to know what that prayer is, because our children are so different. They're doing well in school. You would not recognize these children. So it can be a one-week camp. They do it in weekly meetings, whatever. So here's some pictures of different things coming from these. The lights are still on, but it's just ways of helping the children to express their pain and to bring their pain to Christ. This is a picture from Goma with child soldiers who are forced to kill. Also having them write laments. We do a lot with the laments in the Bible and have people write their laments, and children are able to write laments and often are visibly changed once they've been able to express their pain to God. God, it's not fair that, whatever. We work with the caregivers as well to help them understand a bit about what's going on with the kids and trauma and how to respond. So if we suffer but are not broken by our injuries, our strength increases and can be used with wisdom to help us go beyond our wounds. And we have seen that. We have seen that children can be very wounded. They can have no voice, but by creating a space in the church, and this is, that is a safe space for them where we can allow them to express their pain and to bring it to Christ, they can really heal and go on healed and strengthened from that. So I think we could have the lights again. I want to mention two things before we close. One is there's this organization, Stop Child Witch Accusations, and they have an online thing that you can sign up and try to push through some activism against it. And then there's this one, Équipe pastorale auprès des enfants en détresse. This is something from Congo, I'm sure that Mulumba is very familiar with. You're part of, yeah. So there is a lot going on and a lot that can be done more to respond to this issue. I don't think there's time for questions, so we'll have to go on. Oh, yeah, I have some resources here too. I have some copies of the kids' books. This is the book for the kids. And this is the book for the leader, and this is the book for working with the adults, because, you got to get the whole family on the same page. And here's some brochures. These are just, if you're interested, that explain how this trauma healing works in communities with adults and with kids.